Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This time we're going on a deep dive into a really fascinating story, one that ties together science, ethics, and the legacy of a woman you've probably never heard of, Henrietta Lacks.
Her name might not ring a bell, but her cells, well, those are practically famous in the science world.
Right. I mean, we're talking about HeLa cells, the first immortal human cell line. So we'll be exploring the book that really brought this story to light, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot.
It's an incredible book, and I think it's a story that everyone should know.
Absolutely. It's one of those stories that makes you question what you thought you knew about science and the people behind it.
Exactly. Like here we have these HeLa cells. They've been used in countless scientific breakthroughs, from developing the polio vaccine to understanding cancer. But the woman behind those cells, Henrietta Lacks, her story remained largely unknown for decades.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the human side of science, the individual stories that often get lost in the pursuit of knowledge. So let's start by getting to know Henrietta Lacks herself. What can you tell us about her life?
Henrietta was a young African-American woman living in Turner Station, Maryland. Imagine, it's the 1950s, she's facing poverty, she's got limited access to education, and of course she's dealing with the realities of racial segregation.
And on top of all that, she's raising a family while her husband works at the Sparrows Point steel mill.
Exactly. And despite all these challenges, Skloot paints this really vivid picture of Henrietta's life. You know, her vibrant personality, her love for her family, for dancing. She had this zest for life that really shines through in the book.
That really humanizes her, doesn't it? It's so easy to get caught up in the scientific aspect of her story, but it's important to remember that she was a real person with hopes and dreams and struggles, just like anyone else.
Absolutely. And it's especially important to consider the historical context, right? Because she was treated at Johns Hopkins Hospital, which was a segregated institution at the time.
That's right. And that segregation played a significant role in her experience, didn't it?
Definitely. Even though Johns Hopkins was a leading medical facility, it still reflected the deep-seated inequities of the era. Henrietta, like many Black patients at the time, was treated in a separate ward.
And unfortunately, they often faced a different standard of care.
Sadly, that's true. And it's a crucial part of the story because it helps us understand the complexities of Henrietta's experience and the ethical challenges that emerged from it.
And it was during her treatment for cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins that this pivotal moment in medical history occurred. What can you tell us about that?
Well, as part of her treatment, doctors took a sample of her tumor. But here's the thing, they did it without her knowledge or consent.
Yeah, that's something that really jumps out at you when you read the book. Today, we consider informed consent to be a cornerstone of ethical medical practice. But back then, it wasn't always the case.
Especially for patients in public wards, like Henrietta, it was a common practice, but ethically problematic to say the least.
And this seemingly routine procedure, taking a tissue sample without consent, that's what led to the birth of the HeLa cell line, right?
That's right. Enter Dr. George Gay, this brilliant but kind of eccentric scientist who was completely obsessed with growing human cells in the lab.
It sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. I mean, to think that someone could actually grow cells outside of the body, it's mind-boggling.
I know, right? And back then, it was incredibly difficult. Gay had spent years trying to achieve this, even building his own lab equipment. But most attempts just failed. Cells wouldn't survive outside the body for very long.
So what happened when Gay received the sample of Henrietta's tumor? Was it just another failed experiment?
Well, that's where the story takes this incredible turn. Henrietta's cells, unlike any he'd ever seen before, they started growing with this astonishing vigor. They were doubling in number every 24 hours.
Wait, so they were multiplying at an unprecedented rate. What was going on there?
Right. Gay was amazed. It was like he had finally stumbled upon the impossible, immortal human cells.
That must have been an incredible moment for him after years of struggling to grow cells in the lab. What made Henrietta's cells so different? Why were they able to do what no other cells had done before?
That's a great question, and something that Skloot really delves into in the book. The answer lies in something called telomeres.
Okay, remind me, what are telomeres again? I vaguely remember learning about them in biology class, but it's been a while.
No worries, it's a bit technical. Telomeres, they're like these protective caps on the ends of our chromosomes, and they shorten every time a cell divides.
Okay, I'm following so far. Yeah. So what do telomeres have to do with Henrietta's cells being immortal?
Well, in normal cells, when these telomeres get too short, the cell stops dividing and eventually dies. It's kind of like a built-in expiration date.
So are you saying that Henrietta's cells didn't have this expiration date?
In a way, yes. They had this unusual ability to keep their telomeres from shortening, which allowed them to divide indefinitely.
Wow, that's incredible. But how is that even possible?
It turns out that Henrietta's cells had this active version of an enzyme called telomerase.
Telomerase, that rings a bell. Doesn't it have something to do with keeping those telomeres from shrinking?
You got it. Telomerase basically replenishes the telomeres, preventing them from getting too short. And this unusual activity in Henrietta's cells, it was probably related to her cancer, but it's what allowed those HeLa cells to become the first immortal human cell line.
That's mind-blowing. So we've got these incredible cells that can divide forever, taken without consent. And coming from a woman living in a time of significant social and ethical challenges, it sounds like we're just scratching the surface of a really complex and fascinating story.
Yeah, we've only just begun to uncover the layers of this story. There's so much more to explore, from the impact of HeLa cells on scientific research to the ethical dilemmas surrounding their use, and of course, the story of Henrietta Lacks' family and their journey to reclaim her legacy. You're right, we've just dipped our toes into this story. And the impact of these HeLa cells, well, it was huge, and it happened pretty much right away.
Okay, so we have this Immortal cell line. The scientific world must have been buzzing. But specifically, how were they used?
So one of the biggest things was the development of the polio vaccine. Polio was a terrifying disease, especially in the early 1950s. Thousands of kids were getting paralyzed every year, and HeLa cells, well, they were crucial.
Oh, yeah, for growing the virus in the lab, right?
Exactly. That meant scientists could actually test the vaccine's effectiveness. Without HeLa cells, who knows how much longer it would have taken to get that vaccine out there.
It's amazing to think about the impact those cells had on eradicating such a devastating disease. But I'm guessing their use wasn't limited to just the polio vaccine?
Oh, not at all. HeLa cells were like this sudden Swiss Army knife for researchers. They used them to study the effects of radiation and toxins, like how do those things affect human cells? That helps set safety standards for all kinds of industries.
So these tiny cells from Henrietta Lacks were helping protect workers all over the place. It's crazy to think about.
They even sent HeLa cells into space.
Wait, what? Seriously? They shot these cells into orbit?
They did. They wanted to see how zero gravity affected cell growth. And it wasn't just that. They used HeLa cells to test everything from cosmetics to household products. You name it, they probably use HeLa for it.
It's mind-blowing. These cells were traveling the world, going to space, all while Henrietta's family had absolutely no clue. That's going to be one of the most unsettling parts of this whole story. When did they finally find out about HeLa?
The Lacks family was left in the dark for over 2 decades. Can you imagine? It wasn't until the 1970s that they started getting these weird phone calls, these chance encounters, that slowly revealed the truth.
Wow. It must have been such a disorienting and confusing experience for them. How did they react when they finally understood what was going on?
It was a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, disbelief, anger, you name it. They were furious that no one, not a single doctor or scientist, had bothered to ask for their permission or even tell them what they were doing with Henrietta's cells. Plus, they had no idea how these immortal cells even worked.
I can't even imagine what that must have felt like, finding out that your mother's cells were being used all over the world without your knowledge, without your consent. And on top of that, trying to wrap your head around the science behind it all. It's just incredible.
It's a stark reminder of how important informed consent and transparency are in medical research. And Skloot handles this ethical dimension with so much care.
Right. She doesn't just gloss over the ethical issues. She really weaves the Lacks family's story into the narrative, highlighting their struggles to understand the science, their anger at being left out of the loop.
It really adds a layer of depth and complexity to the story. And you can't talk about this without addressing the issues of race and class, which Skloot does brilliantly. She shows how these factors played a role in how Henrietta and her family were treated by the medical system.
It's so easy to get caught up in the scientific marvels and forget that real people are at the heart of these discoveries, especially someone like Henrietta Lacks, who, because of her race and social standing, was essentially silenced in this whole process.
And it was so important for Skloot to gain the trust of the Lacks family, especially Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, who had so many questions and so much anger.
Building that relationship with Deborah, it sounds like it was key to telling this story authentically. What was that relationship like between Skloot and Deborah?
Skloot spent years building a connection with the Lacks family, especially with Deborah. She was incredibly dedicated to learning about her mother and the science behind HeLa. The book really captures those conversations, their back and forths, Deborah's frustration, her determination. It's powerful stuff.
It's clear that Deborah's quest for knowledge went way beyond just understanding the science, right? It was also about giving her mother a voice, ensuring that she was recognized as more than just a source of cells.
Absolutely. Deborah wanted to know everything about her mother, to put together the pieces of her life. She wanted to know what kind of person her mother was, what she loved, what she feared. She wanted to reclaim her mother's humanity.
And did learning about the science change Deborah's feelings about HeLa cells?
Oh, you see a real transformation in Deborah. She goes from being terrified and resentful of these cells, thinking of them as some monstrous experiment, to actually seeing their beauty, their scientific value.
I read about that scene in the book where she gets to look at her mother's cells under a microscope. That must have been an incredibly powerful experience for her.
Oh, it was huge. It was like that moment brought everything together. The science, the personal, the history. She could finally see HeLa cells as a part of her mother's legacy, a living connection to a woman who'd been essentially erased from the HeLa story.
It's almost like she was able to reconcile those two seemingly opposing realities, the scientific marvel and the deeply personal story of her mother.
Exactly. And that's what makes Skloot's book so compelling. She manages to intertwine these different narratives so beautifully. She blends the science with the personal, she explores the ethical complexities, and she does it all with such sensitivity and respect.
So it's clear that this book is about so much more than just scientific discovery. It's about race, it's about class, it's about medical ethics, it's about recognizing the human stories behind the scientific breakthroughs that shape our world.
And it's a story that continues to resonate today, especially as biotechnology is advancing so rapidly, and the ethical implications of things like genetic research are becoming even more complex.
It's like Henrietta Lack's story is a cautionary tale, reminding us that scientific progress can't come at the expense of individual rights and dignity.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a cautionary tale, but also a story of incredible resilience and impact. Because ultimately, Henrietta Lack's case, well, it really pushed the scientific community to take a hard look in the mirror.
Yeah, her story became this catalyst for real change. I mean, think about it. We now have much stricter rules about informed consent. Researchers can't just take someone's tissue and use it however they please.
It seems so obvious now, right? But back then, not so much. Henrietta's case made it clear that you can't just separate the science from the people involved.
Right? People need to be informed. They need to give their consent. They need to understand what's happening with their own bodies. That's a huge shift in how research is conducted, all thanks to Henrietta Lacks and the people who fought to bring her story to light.
Absolutely. But of course, it's not all simple. There are still these ongoing debates, especially about the commercial side of things.
Right. So patients have more control over their tissues, but should they profit if their cells lead to a big discovery, a new drug, something that makes a company millions? That's where things get complicated.
It's a tough one. On one hand, you've got people saying, hey, if my cells are making someone rich, shouldn't I get a cut? But then you've got others who think human tissues shouldn't be treated like, a product you can buy and sell.
Yeah, where do you draw the line? It's tricky balancing the need for scientific progress with the rights of individuals and the potential for financial gain. Did the Lacks family ever receive any kind of compensation?
Well, not directly, no. But there have been some efforts to acknowledge Henrietta's contributions and support the family.
Rebecca Skloot, the author of the book, she really took that on as part of her mission, didn't she?
She did. She really championed the Lacks family, telling their story, making sure they got the recognition they deserved. And she actually set up the Henrietta Lacks Foundation.
Right. That foundation helps family members.
Yeah.
And also supports people who might have been involved in research that wasn't, ethically sound.
Exactly. And they do a lot of education and outreach, making sure people understand informed consent, the ethical treatment of research subjects, that sort of thing.
That's amazing. It feels like a fitting tribute to Henrietta Lacks, using her story to ensure that something positive comes out of it, to protect others from going through what she and her family went through.
It's really about honoring her legacy and making sure those lessons aren't forgotten. And her story, it's also sparked some really important conversations about race, class, and healthcare disparities.
Right. It shines a light on these systemic issues that have been present in medicine for far too long. It makes you realize that we still have a long way to go to ensure equitable access to healthcare for everyone.
Absolutely. So much of what we take for granted in medical research today, informed consent, ethical guidelines, those things are a direct result of the attention brought to Henrietta Lacks' story.
It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the history of medicine and the ethical choices that were made in the name of progress.
But it's also a story of hope, reminding us that even in the face of injustice, individual stories have the power to change the world.
This deep dive has been truly eye-opening, and The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is one of those books that stays with you long after you finish it. If you're interested in learning more about this incredible story, we highly recommend checking out the book.
And of course, don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more fascinating explorations into the world of science, history, and the human experience. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.